will be sending 2 teams to the state of New York's Model EU program. So they do an European Union simulation. We sent a team last year, and we'll send another one this year. Last year was in Buffalo, and this year will be in New York City. Also as part of the annual HCLAS trip to Washington, D.C., we will be visiting the European Parliament Liaison Office. And then we will be having several speaker series. This is the kickoff event of that speaker series. And we have another event coming up in October entitled The Challenge of Islamophobia in Europe. And we are pleased to have Fareed Hafez will be speaking. He's a visiting professor of international studies at Williams College. And that, again, is Wednesday, October 12th during the same time period, 11:20 to 12:45. Although the grant will focus on anti-discrimination and hate crime policy in the EU, it's also important to think about what is happening here in the United States. We, too, have witnessed a rise or continuation of forms of discrimination and hate crimes across many groups in the U.S., similar to what we are seeing in Europe. And so this is an opportunity in today's event just to begin the dialogue and the examination to think about how discrimination and hate crimes manifest themselves in Europe, and how does that compare to our reality in the United States? And what kinds of policy tools are being used in the European Union, and how do they compare to the United States? What can we learn from the European experience? So I have a few thank yous, because none of this would have been possible without a lot of help. So first, I'd like to thank the Cultural Center, who has been incredibly helpful with all of the organization, the beautiful posters, getting the word out, and in particular, Kathleen Collins and Carol Mallison have really been at the forefront of organizing. I'd also like to thank the Hofstra College of Arts and Sciences Interim Dean Daniel Siebold for his support in this program. And I'd especially like to thank Hofstra's Office for Research and Sponsored Programs. I'd like to thank Sophia Kakoulidis, the Vice Provost for Research and Sponsored Programs. And in particular, I'm going to ask you to come up, Alice. I want to thank Alice Baum-Diaz, who is the Assistant Provost for Research and Sponsored Programs. Come on up. I have a little something for Alice. Alice worked in 2 time zones tirelessly to get this to the finish line. So she was really instrumental in getting this done and completed. And so thank you. Come on up. I have a little something for you. And I also want to thank my colleagues for bringing their classes. Professor Jensen and Professor Pugliese, thank you so much for bringing your classes as well. We all appreciate it. And last but not least, the participating faculty. So let me just introduce them all to you. So to my immediate right, I have Professor Sally Charnow, who is the chair and also professor of history. I have Santiago Slobodsky, who is the Robert and Florence Kaufman Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies and Chair in Jewish Studies and Associate Professor of Religion. Professor Paul Fritz, who is Associate Professor of Political Science. And you will be hearing from each one of them this morning. I just want to give one quick disclaimer, which is required for the grant, that this event is funded by the European Union. Views and opinions expressed are, however, those of the presenters only and do not necessarily reflect those of the European Union or Hofstra University. Neither the European Union nor Hofstra can be held responsible for them. That's my disclaimer. So what I'd like to do is I want to start out in just giving you a little bit of an introduction of what is the European Union, what can the European Union do, what's sort of the tools that it might have to deal with these kinds of questions of anti-discrimination and hate crimes. So to start out with the big question of what is the European Union? And I'm sure you've all heard about the European Union, but you may not be familiar of what exactly it is. So you want to think of the European Union as something that is what we call supranational, meaning that it is above the nation state. There are 27 member states, European countries that are members of the European Union. And if you look at the history of European integration, it starts out as integration of economies across Europe. And it's possible that some of you think about the European Union as a form of economic integration. But what I want to sort of push you today to understand is that the European Union is not just about economic integration. It is very much about political integration. And it has become a political project to really create a union across Europe, across many different policy sectors. One of the challenges that the European Union has, because it is something that is above the member states, is that we still have the sovereignty of the members, meaning that the 27, each individual of those 27 member states, still is the ultimate authority within their territory. But that has been somewhat changed with the creation of the European Union and with increased integration of the European Union over time. So that's a little bit of sort of what is the European Union and how do we understand it from the perspective of state sovereignty. So there is an infringement on sovereignty, and yet member states still maintain a certain amount of sovereignty. And you'll see in this discussion today, that's a bit of the challenge. There are legal underpinnings coming from the European Union that sort of shape what the European Union can do about issues of discrimination. And one thing that you should also note is that European Union law is supreme to national law, which might surprise some of you. When I say EU law, that is the series of treaties, so there is no constitution of the European Union. Instead, it's, quote unquote constitution is a series of treaties. That body of treaties makes up EU law. Any European Union Court of Justice decisions, the European Union Court of Justice is very similar to like our Supreme Court in the United States. Their judgments must apply to all member states. And then, of course, any EU legislation that comes out of the European Union through the process of how basically a bill becomes a law in the European Union, those are part of EU law. Now, if we start thinking about, where does the EU impact sovereignty and not impact sovereignty, there are certain areas, and scholars of the European Union always say, well, social policy, when it comes to social issues, for example, something maybe like the welfare state, the EU is not going to touch it. We're going to stay away from it and not get involved. However, what we have found is that the European Union has begun to move into areas related to social policy. And one of the earliest, and Professor Charnow is going to talk about this, one of the earlier ones is actually gender. And the reason why gender ends up moving into EU law and the body of EU law is that with the European Union, you have free movement of people. And if you have free movement of people that can work and live anywhere in Europe, they all have to be treated the same across member states. And that means you can't have discrimination according to gender in the workplace because you want to have the same thing across all member states. So there had been a lot of earlier work in the latter part of the 20th century dealing with the issue of gender because it's part of the free market. And so that's sort of where the EU begins to pick up momentum on the issue of anti-discrimination. In 1999, the Amsterdam Treaty, which is one of the treaties, I told you there's a series of treaties that creates the body of law and sort of, if you will, the constitution of the European Union. And in 1999, the Amsterdam Treaty comes into force. And what happens to be in the Amsterdam Treaty is something called Article 13. I'm going to read you this article because I think it's kind of interesting when you think about comparing it to our own Constitution of the United States or our own Bill of Rights. Because remember, this is written in technically 1997, and a little prior to that. It goes into force in 99, so it has sort of contemporary language in it. Without prejudice to the other provisions of this treaty, and within the limits of the powers conferred by it upon the community, the Council, acting unanimously on a proposal from the Commission, and after consulting the European Parliament, those are all main institutions of the European Union that I just listed there, may take appropriate action to combat discrimination based on sex, racial or ethnic origin, religion or belief, disability, age, or sexual orientation. So that is in one of the EU treaties, the Amsterdam Treaty in 1999. Following that, in 2000, the European Union wrote a directive called the Racial Equality Directive. And the reason why it emerges in 2000 has everything to do with what was going on politically in Europe at the time. In 1999-2000, we have the emergence of a far-right party in Austria becoming a governing party, part of a governing coalition in Austria. And so when I say a far-right party, a political party that had used a lot of anti-Semitic, racial types of language as part of their party platform. And so European Union was quite upset about this, that the party would be part of a governing coalition in a major member state of the European Union. And so the Racial Equality Directive was written at the European Union level. And the directive states that implementing the principle of equal treatment between persons, irrespective of racial or ethnic origin, lays down a framework to protect against discrimination. So, in a directive, by the way, let me clarify this, it means that these are goals that countries should meet, but the European Union does not, in a directive, and this is sort of to deal with sovereignty, doesn't tell you how to do it, it just tells you you should try to achieve these goals. Okay, so they're ideals, they're goals. And then the last piece that's a legal underpinning is something called the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And that became enshrined in the Lisbon Treaty, which came into effect in 2009, and that is the last treaty that we've had so far. And what the Charter of Fundamental Rights did was it reinforced the EU's legal responsibility regarding anti-discrimination. And so I'm just going to read you a couple articles. Article 1 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights is human dignity is inviolable. It must be respected and protected. Article 3 states that everyone has the right to respect for his or her physical and mental integrity. And Article 21, and this is really relevant to what we'll all be speaking about today, any discrimination based on any ground such as sex, race, color, ethnic or social origin, genetic features, language, religion or belief, political or any other opinion, membership of a national minority, property, birth, disability, age, or sexual orientation shall be prohibited. So that's the legal underpinning that the European Union has to deal with questions of anti-discrimination. There are also institutional aspects of the European Union that help us understand, how is the European Union organized that it can deal with questions of anti-discrimination. One of the institutions that was founded in 2007, technically it existed prior, it was sort of reorganized and renamed in 2007, is the Fundamental Rights Agency, or what is known as FRA. It is an institution that is part of the European Union, and their focus is on gathering research, data, and helping with policy prescriptions on all kinds of forms of discrimination. And really, FRA has been instrumental in providing the data that has really inspired some of the policies that we've seen recently. For From an institutional perspective, just to give you some things that have happened very recently, a lot of this move on anti-discrimination policy has been quite recent. For example, in 2015, the European Union created, within the European Commission, which is the executive body of the European Union, coordinators to address both anti-Muslim hate and to combat anti-Semitism. So two positions to deal with these issues. And in 2021, last fall, emerged the comprehensive strategy to combat anti-Semitism throughout Europe. In 2020, the European Union presented the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan, which is a 5-year plan from 2020 to 2025. It's not an accident that this emerges in 2020. It very much was inspired by the Black Lives Movement here in the United States. So you can see a little bit of a symbiotic relationship between what we do in the US and what goes on in Europe. This anti-racism action plan provides a lot of guidelines. They are suggestions. Again, member states have sovereignty, but they are suggestions on how countries should address racism. We've also seen the Commission itself, the executive body, really focusing on these kinds of issues, such as, if you look at the sort of cabinet positions, if you will, they're called directorate generals, but they're like cabinet positions in the U.S. government. You have one that's called Promoting Our European Way of Life, that focuses on issues such as creating a union of equality and diversity. There's also a directorate general, again, sort of cabinet position, called Values and Transparency, that focuses just on monitoring, well, as a part of what they do, monitoring the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which I've presented to you. So the EU has made anti-discrimination, particularly in the areas of gender, religion, particularly focused on Jews and Muslims, LGBTQ community, the Roma community, peoples of color, and also dealing more generally with xenophobia as a priority and a goal of the European Union. The EU has sought to address anti-discrimination wherever it appears, and that also includes in the digital age, and that means online social media and the spread of hate speech that is online. But I want to point out that the EU does have its limitations that are related to sovereignty and ensuring that things are properly implemented. You have 27 member states, so oversight and enforcement can be very challenging. So addressing these issues, however, are central to what the European Union is all about. It is a club of democracies. And as a club of democracies, it's imperative for the European Union to address discrimination, racism, and xenophobia. And today, as we have witnessed, the rise or the continuation of anti-Muslim hate, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and discrimination against the LGBTQ and Roma communities throughout Europe. And so our discussion today will try to unpack some of why this has occurred and the role that the European Union has taken in addressing these trends. So with that, I would like to turn to our panel to have a discussion looking at some of these policy areas in which our faculty have expertise. So we're going to start with Professor Sally Charnow from the History Department, and she's going to talk about gender parity and equity.
Great. Thank you, Carolyn. Welcome, everyone. So this is a mixed report card, I would say, overall. Among international institutions, the EU stands out in its foregrounding of the goal of gender equality, equality between men and women among its fundamental values and objectives, in its treaties, as Carolyn mentioned, and in its secondary legislations, and has committed to mainstreaming or employing gender considerations into all aspects of its operations. As an institution, the EU has plenty of formal legislation and rules to prevent discrimination and promote gender equality, but few powers to enforce these. In other words, it has non-binding action plans or what's called soft laws, but none of them really have teeth except with respect to employment and labor issues. On paper, the EU recognizes and embraces principles of gender equality, and member states are legally required to act within this framework. Yet, individuals are often unable to exercise their right to equality despite its former legality for historical, systemic, national, and other complex and structural realities. It's important to note that the EU initially narrowly defined its competencies with regard to gender equality as pertaining to labor market issues, and Carolyn sort of pointed to this. It was linked to equal pay for equal work in the capitalist market economy, and not linked to feminist principles of equity broadly understood, nor was it framed as justice, but merely as fair competition in the labor market participation. The EU can only legally protect rights related to gender equality that are connected to the single market, and that means related to access to employment and training, goods and services. That said, there's been significant feminist criticism of this narrow notion of equality that we'll talk about a little bit later in our Q&A. Given these stated values of the EU, I thought it would be interesting to ask about the representation of women in EU member governments. Even if gender equality is predominantly aspirational in the EU, has that aspiration had an impact on women in leadership positions? So, how do member state parliaments compare when it comes to gender equality and the role of women in government? I took a deep dive here. On July 15, 2022, for the first time in its history, France elected a woman as the head of its lower house of parliament. With her and Elizabeth Borne, who was appointed the country's prime minister, France is now led by two women, one the head of parliament and the other head of government, reflecting the country's efforts to improve gender equality. It's an effort that's unevenly shared across the European Union. France, along with Italy, increased the share of elected women in parliament, and from 2003 to 2021, they went from 12% to 39% in France, and from 10% to almost 36% in Italy. In 2021, Sweden was the country with the highest number of female parliamentarians, with just over 47%, and that was followed by Finland, Belgium, Austria, Denmark, Spain, Portugal, and France. This figure is the highest ever achieved in the European Union. Of course, Sweden just had an election last week in which the far right emerged as the new power, and the government has not been formed yet. The former female prime minister has stepped down, so we don't know what will happen there. No EU country has reached a 50-50 sex ratio in parliament, nor had a majority of women members of parliament. Sweden, Finland, and Belgium are the three most consistent member states in terms of having the highest representation, with averages of 46%, 42%, and 39% as an average between 2003 and 2021. And just sidebar here, in the US, 27% of our members of the legislation, Congress and Senate, is just 27%. And in that sense, we are equal to Bulgaria, where women in parliament between 2003 and 2021 sit at about 24.5%. Malta, Hungary, and Romania bring up the rear, with 11% for the first two and 13% of their parliaments being made up of women. Switching from member states to the European Parliament itself, it has also failed to break the glass ceiling for women. The current mandate resulting from the 2019 elections has the highest rate of women represented in the European Parliament at this moment, which hovers between 39 and 40%. The European Parliament is currently chaired by a woman from Malta, Roberta Metsola, and she is only the third woman to hold this position since the creation of the institution. So oddly, surprisingly for me, there are more women when we look at government, look at the ministries, than when we look at members of parliament. Looking at percentages, this situation appears more favorable for these women in government. While no European Parliament has ever had more women than men, several governments have already had more women than men. So the two examples that stand out are Sweden and Finland. With gender equity at the top, they have been made up of more than 50% women, believe it or not. 5 countries, meanwhile, Hungary, Greece, Malta, Cyprus, and Slovakia, have appointed less than 15% of women to their governments between 2003 and 2021, with Hungary, again, having the least number of women in government with an average of only 8% during the same period. So, is that the whole picture? The figures do not really reveal, though, the nature of these portfolios held by women ministers. In 2018, there was a study, and 2/3 of the male ministers were in ministries of state or controlling economic functions, compared to half of their female counterparts. In addition, 40% of female ministers were given socio-cultural portfolios compared to only 19% of men. So how do we understand that? Men are given these sort of, if you will, hard ministries of economics, politics, foreign affairs, and women are given that quote-unquote softer areas. The European Parliament points out that at the national level, there is little change in discriminatory practices in these sort of as it kind of unfolds with women in government and in parliament. It shows that quantitative parity cannot compare entirely with what we might call qualitative parity. And that's an interesting thing to think about. And so is equality, the number, the same as the quality, the kinds of portfolios that ministers hold? So there are other obstacles, and I'll close with this, but there are other obstacles that I think are important for us to look at for women when they are entering politics in the European Union. There are many obstacles to greater participation in political life, having to do with sexism in their various countries, which is systemic almost everywhere. And it includes unequal access to resources, unequal division of domestic and family tasks, the double burden it used to be called, sexist political cultures, gender stereotypes, and lack of female role models for women to sort of be mentored by. And then there's sexist and sexual violence. In a report published in 2018, there was a conclusion that 85%, this is an enormous number, 85% of female parliamentarians in Europe had been victims of psychological violence in parliaments. 68% had been the target of sexist comments, and 25% victims of sexual violence. The report stated the level of abuse and violence against women in political and public life, because they are women, and sometimes because of their increased presence, is in itself a growing problem. It also risks deterring women from engaging in politics because they find the environment too toxic. And one reporter also, sort of just to conclude, recognized that even for women in government or in politics in general, their careers tend to be shorter than their male counterparts. So it's an uneven balance sheet. So, I don't know, so I hand it back to you, or hand it to Santiago.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you so much, Professor Charnow. That was very interesting. I'm going to now have Professor Santiago Slobodski talk about entanglements, historical, political, and discursive, of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and racism in Europe.
Thank you very much, Professor Dudek. It's very nice to see all of you here. I want to thank all of you for coming, especially our colleagues who are also here sharing this with us. And I want to ask you a question to start reflecting on this together. When you have a problem at the personal or the social level, what do? There is certain kind of urgency of trying to find a solution for the problem. But sometimes when you try to find a solution without analyzing how we got where we are, we find the wrong solutions. And most of the time when we talk about antisemitism, xenophobia, and racism, and we jump right away into public policy, we sometimes miss the point of what is really happening. So today what I want to share with you a little bit is to talk a little bit about 3 questions I have been pondering for some time. When we look at the news, you are going to see many times different kinds of discriminations interrelated with each other. And I want to ask with you and reflect with you how this happens, why this happens, and finally, after we have some clarity in terms of how and why, we can respond what to do with it. So even though the European Union is particularly interested in public policy and trying to solve the issue that is urgent, and I want to get there, we need a good analysis of actually how and why this is happening. For this reason, I want to present you 2 different cases, 2 different models that help us to explain a little bit what is the relation between these different kind of racism. The first one happens in the US. 2018-19, there is a large group of people working, escaping political and economic oppression in Central America to the US. And this was known by certain media and politicians as the caravan. I don't know if you are familiar with this or not. And the narratives that came during this time was the following. These people who are actually escaping oppression, that is economical and political, are actually being paid by the Jewish community in order to impurify the country, and among them, there are some Muslims who are hidden, and they are coming to actually have terrorist attack in the US. Since from this perspective, both people coming from Central America and Muslims, according to this view, were what they would call brown people, they confuse one and the other. I can tell you for sure, the people escaping economic and political oppression were not by the Jewish people, they were not Muslims among them, but there was a conspiracy emerging, talking about the idea that all the barbarians attack you at the same time. We need to protect ourselves against all the threats, all in one. This is a second case I want to talk to you a little bit that is happened actually this year in Europe. During some time, Germany was the model to talk about the Holocaust. In comparison, for example, what happened with Austria, as Professor Dudek was talking before about the emergence of a right-wing party as part of the coalition of government. In Germany, after the Holocaust, they have gone through a process of what is called denazification, and a strong structure of Holocaust education to ensure that that will not happen again. This education has been a model for many people, and actually many people have tried to imitate it throughout the world with different luck. But in the last 5, 6, 7 years, something else happened. What happened is that the quantity of people who are immigrating to Germany, they were being told that any kind of communal organization they were having, in order to protect themselves against a majority culture that was rejecting them, was part of some kind of a regressive culture that was going to make people return to those dark days of National Socialism. So you are having the descendants of people who actually commit the Holocaust, telling people from the Global South who were not part of this that they are bringing a new Hitler to Germany. In this case, it is not all the barbarians attacked together, but the Holocaust gets instrumentalized in order to push away people from integration into one of the central countries of the European Union. So what you have here is 2 different models of entanglement. The first model, all the barbarians attack you together. The second model, you are, or the state, the liberal state, is instrumentalizing the genocide against one people in order to limit the absorption of another. So we have here 2 very, very different models of entanglement. Most of the time, the different discriminations happen at the same time. Sometimes they come together, sometimes they are mobilized differently. An extension of the second case is what happened in Ukraine in the current war, where the West accused Putin of trying to commit a new genocide and say that actually Putin is following some kind of Nazi strategies, and Putin is saying is coming to dis-Nazify Ukraine, with actually a Jewish president leading the fact. So what I'm trying to say here is try to explain, first of all, the how things are happening. Discriminations and racism are all around the world. They are spiking in many places. But the forms that they take, the relation among them, change according to different geopolitical circumstances. So we might have the urge of going and combat everything. But at the same time, when we think about policies, I want to think for a moment, what interests are being served when we are interrogating certain faiths and not others? Or we are talking about those at the same time or not. What I'm trying to say here is that this is a complex issue, and it requires a very, very deep analysis of how the system many times mobilize one minority community against the other, to the extent that the big player gets completely invisibilized, because it is all about the impossible confrontation between two minority communities. This happened with the confrontation between Muslims and Jews, especially in France. It has happened with the confrontation, for example, between Jews and Afro-Americans in the US. I want to talk not only about how these communities are discriminated, but also how these big players get completely effaced when we talk about discrimination, because we can only think of the big player as the mediator between two communities that hate each other for immemorial times, when this has been artificially constructed. So to finish with this, I want to say the following. We have the urge of combating antisemitism, Islamophobia, and racism. Public policy and what do we do with it should be at the forefront of what we do. But at the same time, we need to think that cannot be the first step, because we might be finished supporting certain kind of politics that goes against what we think we are supporting. So I am asking us to think deeply, to analyze a little bit, to see how different communities get instrumentalized, not to finish with racism and discrimination, but actually to reproduce racism and discrimination. So thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you so much. And now I turn to Professor Fritz, who will talk about the nexus between discrimination, hate speech, and political violence, as well as terrorism in the European Union.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to go after my colleagues and listen to what they're talking about. And I'm going to be picking up on their themes in a lot of ways, but in a slightly different way. As Professor Dudek said, I'm looking at this nexus between hate speech and discrimination, and when it turns violent, when it actually is becomes some form of political violence and terrorism or something else. And, you know, as my colleagues were speaking, I had all kinds of thoughts popping up in my head, so forgive me if I'm a little disjointed, because I want to try to bring them in, but also try to do this during the Q&A more so. But let me just start by saying, you know, looking at this, you know, there's a problem that we face as scholars of political violence. When does something like discrimination and hate speech actually turn into violence? There's a lot more discrimination and hate in the world than there is actual violence, thankfully. But that's a challenge for us in some ways, studying it, especially in the context of online hate speech and discrimination, because we've seen this just explode. And yes, there's some manifestations of this. There has been an uptick in violence associated with this, but it still poses a big challenge for scholars and for policymakers to understand this as well. But I do want to say that what we've seen with the EU, and we'll compare this to other countries and other regions in the world later, the EU has sort of taken a particular interest in this lately, specifically looking at online hate speech and discrimination and how to regulate this and try to stop this, not just for the purposes of eliminating discrimination and hate speech, but also trying to curb the violence that comes from this. I think that what's happened in the EU, specifically I'll talk in just a minute about what's called the Digital Services Act, which was just passed this year and will be implemented by 2024, is an interesting step in terms of how governments may think about regulating online speech in a way that in the US we really haven't thought of or are constrained in thinking of, and we'll see how it plays out. But let me give you some background on this issue before I go into those sorts of things. Of course, discrimination, hate speech is nothing new. What is new about all of this is the ability for perpetrators of these types of ideas to spread it so quickly and efficiently through online platforms. That's the struggle we've been dealing with for the past couple of decades. What we've seen in particular in certain areas, and this is by necessity since I have limited time, pretty limited to what I can say, but what we've seen in particular within the EU context as well as other countries is an increase in anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-immigrant movements, misogynistic movements like incel communities that are perpetrating violence, espousing violent rhetoric towards women and other things. For lack of a better term, let me lump these all together into sort of basically right-wing movements. They're not all exclusively right-wing movements, but they are, there is a common thread. You could also say that there's a sort of a common thread of extremist Christian nationalism within them as well. So there's a whole bunch of things going on with these types of dynamics that we're seeing in Europe as well as in the US and other places. Some of them have led to some high-profile attacks, right? We think there's a link between some sort of the spread of hate and discrimination and listing of manifestos and recruitment programs by certain groups. The terrible attack in Norway in 2011 that killed 77 people, which was very clearly a right-wing, Islamophobic, anti-immigrant attack, certainly displays this pattern. Where there was a type of online radicalization leading to a really violent, terrible, awful attack. Other attacks, anti-Semitic attacks in France and Germany followed similar patterns. There's a report that came out in 2020 by the Center for Strategic and International Studies that compares sort of violence in Europe, non-state violence in Europe, terrorist attacks. What we've seen is the groups that are motivated by anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-immigrant sentiments, sometimes lumped together as neo-Nazi movements or other types of things, or extremist nationalist movements. The proportion of all those terrorist attacks since 2015 has significantly increased. It's gone up a lot, in short. There's still a lot of attacks that are perpetrated, at least in the time period in the study, by violent jihadist groups. And others, but the right-wing attacks have gone up a lot. That mirrors, by the way, what's going on in the US in terms of the attacks. The number of deaths from those attacks is also going up in terms of right-wing movements. They're killing more people. A lot of the expressions of hate speech and discrimination, sometimes they are not terrorism per se, but hate crimes. We can talk about that in the EU or in the American context. Those are up too, but by the way, hate crimes only get reported about 10% of the time when they occur both in the United States and in Europe. All of this is sort of to say what we're seeing is a significant problem in Europe where sort of the violent rhetoric we think is playing into an actual expression of violence. Now, this is a tricky part in a lot of ways. Or there's many tricky things to this. Terrorism goes up and down in waves. There have been previous waves of right-wing terrorism in Europe. There have been previous waves of different patterns of discrimination and hate speech in Europe as in other places too, beyond Europe. But what we're seeing is sort of with the continued movements online and the dissemination of this movement, information online, is probably suggesting a pattern, right? And the EU has noticed this, the US has noticed this, the UN has noticed this. All of these governing bodies have reports out on all of this. The EU has taken some actions that are kind of interesting and maybe interesting to think about from the American context. Very quickly, I'll talk about two before I get to the Digital Services Act, or one before the Digital Services Act. One, I want to talk about the Online Code of Conduct to Combat Hate Speech. This was a sort of something that's probably a little more familiar to the American audience in terms of the EU partnering with tech companies to try to get them to produce codes of conduct online that they will enforce on their own. So trying to define what hate speech is, what violent rhetoric is, and other types of things, and pushing those tech companies to then take that content down. That's sort of a background in a sense that's similar to what the US is doing. I can talk about that later. But getting to things, defining hate speech, one, as the public incitement to violence or hatred on the basis of certain characteristics, including race, color, religion, descent, national or ethnic origin. Trying to voluntarily police that sort of thing with these platforms, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, those sorts of things. Worked okay. There was an assessment in 2019 that platforms are actually doing this, voluntarily doing this, trying to take down content. But the volume of it is just increased, even if they're taking down these much of this content. The Digital Services Act that was passed earlier this year that I mentioned before is something that I'm going to be looking at in some more detail because it's very interesting, because this is actual regulation. This is actual regulation of online content that the online providers, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and others, have to actually take down content within a certain period of time or be liable for this. Not criminally liable, but financially liable. They'll face fines and punishments if they do not take down hate speech, if they do not take down incitements to violence and other sorts of things. We know that this is an issue in a sense, a big problem, and the reason, one of the manifestations, one of the impetus for this is things like the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand, for example. This was live streamed. This was a terrible attack on a mosque that was live streamed. It was taken down quickly by Facebook, but not quickly enough, and this video spread everywhere. And it was all over. You can probably still find it on YouTube and other places. What the EU wants to do with the Digital Services Act is to stop this, because what happens when you live stream an attack like this, there are copycats. There are others who are inspired by this sort of thing, right? So this is the effort that we're seeing within the EU right now. Very quickly, I'm going to wrap up by saying, is this going to work? I don't know. We'll see. Some of the questions that my colleague was bringing up about getting to the how and the why probably matter as much as this policy. But I'm just going to say, when we're talking about this regulation and it's trying to actually regulate what's on the internet, we'll debate that in the U.S. context because we have a very specific context of what that means here. But bureaucracies trying to regulate private actors are always a step behind. So what happens is with online content, people figure out what's going on, right? They can manipulate algorithms. They can go after this kind of stuff. So the bureaucracy, the European Commission is going to try to implement this. It's going to have a big challenge of this. But it's going to be a very interesting experiment that's going to tackle sort of the hate speech, the discrimination that we see online, and also maybe this link to violence. So I went a little bit over. I apologize for that. Looking forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. Very interesting. And so what we wanted to do sort of in this format as we discussed how we wanted to do this, I kind of want to open it up to my colleagues. I have a few questions that I'm going to ask them. And then we're going to open it up to you, our audience, to also ask questions as well related to the presentations, and even if you have questions more generally about the European Union and this policy area. So I'm going to start with Professor Charnow. So I know that you've been taking a deep dive into gender parity issues and the EU as you prepare for your women's studies classes this semester. And my question is, what has surprised you in your research so far?
I am going to answer that question, but I just want to say something to Paul, because I don't know if any of you saw, there was a New York Times article, front page, about the Russian intervention into the digital world just after the Women's March in 2017. So it brings all of these things together. 4 million women marched in the United States after the election in 2016 on the day of the inauguration. Apparently, there was this huge digital attack, but the attack went against a particular woman, somebody I know, Linda Sarsour, who's a Palestinian rights activist in New York. So it's just an interesting sort of way in which these sort of issues are way beyond the EU too. I mean, these are global in terms of cyber attacks, in terms of racism, and Islamophobia, anti-immigrant sensibility, and misogyny. Just bring it home there. So, but back to your question, I think the thing that surprised me the most as a feminist was really thinking about the ways in which equality was framed by the EU, and gender equality in particular, of course, because it's my area. Because it also created, by looking at it in that way, it also creates economic and structural barriers. Because as a feminist, my lens is bigger than that, right? I mean, here we are in this capitalist economy, and this only is looking at wage labor in a certain way. So how do we account for all the unpaid labor? How do we account for the care economy, caring for children, caring for elders, caring for sick people who live in your home? So I'm sort of more in the Santiago framework here of like the how and the why, right? I mean, how do we attend to these kinds of what we would call intersectional discriminations? And that's a much more complex question, and also the ways in which feminists, I think, bring to bear the term equity. What are the resources we need to bring people to equality, not giving everyone the same resources, because not all people need the same resources, right? So that was a huge surprise for me in the sort of narrowness of the EU framing, and also the ways in which it, in some cases, weakened member states' welfare state programs and structures, and in fact hurt many women who were recipients of those welfare state programs. And so, it also, and just to conclude, it brings up this question of, can there actually be equality in a neoliberal state? I mean, that is really, on some fundamental level, that's what we're talking about. How does neoliberal capitalism play out in creating disparity and inequality? So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask Professor Slobodski a question. So when we talk about forms of discrimination in Europe, is there a connection among anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and racism?
Thank you very much. Let me start, try to answer the question by following up a little what Professor Charnow was talking about. I believe that these policies, in order to attack, I would say, prevent individuals from copycats, from factoring new attacks, I think is very, very helpful. There is an urgency because people are dying. People are at risk. So I don't want to undermine those, I would say, those projects. At the same time, the question is, many times it is easier to point out the people who commit this extreme violence without understanding that there is a system that precedes the possibility of this violence, and by attacking individually the extremists, we don't see how the system works. And that goes to the question. The problem is not just the right-wing extremists, which are a problem. It is also what the right-wing extremists and the liberal state share. And I just think when we see actually what they share, we are going to see a little bit what is the problem. And the question is the idea of unwaged labor helping the system or not? What is the history of unwaged labor? In this way, how racism and sexism have played since the beginning of modernity hand to hand to create this idea of unwaged labor. People who work are not being paid for what they work, creating wealth for other people. Of course, we can go after the consequences and bring in front of a judge the people who commit atrocities, and we should. But at the same time, when we do that, we actually are not acknowledging the system itself is reproducing these problems. And that goes to the question of Dr. Charnow. Can we have a fair way of rewarding people in a liberal economy? I don't know. Does discrimination serve a function for both the liberal state and the right-wingers that we should persecute, that perhaps serves someone's interest? And it's not just the irrational, crazy people out there doing stuff, but actually discrimination has a rationality, anti-Semitism has a rationality, anti-black racism has a rationality, and instead of thinking they are kind of crazy, we need to think how it is presented and how it's structured. And this is why I want to answer now the question. Sorry for that, but the question is how all this started, how all this connection started. I would just say that even though we are going to have discrimination and construction of otherness throughout history, it is only in the 16th century when something actually happened. There is one power that is going to increasingly become global through both the construction of the nation state in Europe by Catholics expelling Jews and Muslims, and by the conquest of the Americas taking over the resources from natives and kidnapping people in Africa and making them into slaves to create the completely non-paid and wage labor. This is a moment in the 16th century when something happened in which all these racisms get untangled in different ways, but they actually get untangled. And I just think that we need to look a little bit at how history has contracted these relations, not as an accident, not far out of irrationality, not for those crazy people who need to limit themselves from Facebook, and we should limit themselves from Facebook, yes, but at the same time how the most progressive and liberal of the projects already has with it the conception that the nation and state should overlap, so one nation, one state, and everything else should be out, should be included, or you expel it, or you erase it. And how we actually construct wealth by stealing resources and labor from other people. How the system has been constructed not as an accident, not as an extreme idea, but very much at the central of this. And I just want to explain one example of this, which is a little bit what I do, which is the issues of antisemitism. In the moment in which Jews are expelled from Spain, the first global empire, they are offered the possibility of converting or leaving. The idea is that the state needs to be pure and Catholic. It is in this context in which many Jews left, but many of them converted. Even when they converted, they were being suspicious about not being able to integrate the body politics and corrupting, impurifying the system. This is a moment in which there is an emergence of a number of forgeries, such as a forgery of a little bit before when some French Jews asked the strongest Jews from Turkey what to do when Catholic powers come to them and force them to convert. In the early 15th century, there's a letter called the Letter of Constantinople. That is a forgery, which is not real, it was created for a reason. And the letter says that the Turkish Jews answer the French Jews, don't worry, convert to Christianity to save your lives. And later on, become the lawyers, become the entertainers, become the physicians, and erode Christianity from between. This is the first time that Jews who have been accused of poisoning wells during medieval times, who have been accused of conspiracies before, it is the first time that Jews are related with a transnational conspiracy of being inside populations, trying to destroy them from between. That sounds familiar with something? Okay, that is happening out there today in Europe and the US. So when we think that the problem of Jewish conspiracies is a problem for the last 30 years, or we think about Jewish conspiracies is coming from the Muslim world, or is coming from a Catholic world in the Americas, we don't think that actually was integral part of a progressive project coming, and not only coming, but also constituting what how Europe think of itself today. So I'm going to say, anti-Semitism as Islamophobia, I can say the same thing with Islamophobia, I can explain later, is a constitutive part of how Europe built itself. So, anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or racism are not accidents of a few crazy people who go there and kill people. Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and racism are in the ground of how Europe have thought, thinks, and perhaps will think itself. Can we change how Europe thinks itself? Yes, we can change. We can have policies, we can have things. But at the same time, so far, things have not been changing.
Thank you. Professor Fritz. So what do we know about the link between online discrimination, hate speech, and violent rhetoric leading to real-world violence in the European Union and elsewhere? And if you could, in particular, focus on the United States.
Yes, absolutely. And to follow along a little bit with what my colleague said, it's just to make the point very clear that the online expression of this doesn't mean that it's new in any way, right? Or that there are systems that have engendered this that has it baked in. I think there's some interesting dialogue and discussion we need to have about what to do in that context, and I might have a slightly different point of view. But I want to come back to that later, because this is more sort of looking at the manifestation of it. This question is right, and what to do this. And the answer to this question is we don't know enough, really, to be quite honest. Online discrimination, hate speech, and violent rhetoric leading to real-world attacks. Yeah, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence for this. We also do know with more certainty that violent groups or hate groups use online to attract recruits, and they've been very effective at this. And we also know that the algorithms that are used by YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and others point people to more and more extreme viewpoints for various reasons. They want to keep people's eyes glued to screens, so they want to provoke outrage, and so they draw people in this way. The problem is that there are many millions of people that see this kind of stuff every single day, and very few of them actually turn to violence. Sort of a small number. Terrorism and other forms of political violence is always a small numbers phenomenon, right? There's a lot of people experiencing these kinds of things, these awful ideas, hate speech, discrimination, and they may in fact become, more racist in their views and more discriminatory in their actions and thoughts, but they don't necessarily become violent. So we have to. That's the question, I guess, that we have to get to, is how to do this. Now, if we're thinking about the context of the EU, I mentioned earlier in my talk that there's a lot of one attack spurs another. There's sort of copycat attacks, and this is not a new phenomenon, by the way. This is not just an internet phenomenon. This is something that's happened before with terrorism or other political violence over and over again, but it's just magnified in this sense. Within the EU, sort of after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, for example, there was a spate of further anti-Semitic attacks across France and other places. Anders Breivik, the person who attacked in Norway, inspired all kinds of other attacks. He was the model for the Christchurch attack in New Zealand in a lot of ways, who took it another step farther by actually live streaming the attacks. So we think there's some links. In the US, we know that there's links, right? If we think about awful attacks that we've seen that have been racial in nature, the attack in Charleston, South Carolina at the Mother Emanuel Church, historically black church. The perpetrator of this attack was radicalized by viewing content that was suggesting that black on white crime in the U.S. was the major driver of crime, and this is sort of the hook. And then he got into neo-Nazi sites and other sorts of things. So anecdotally, we know a lot. Systematically, we don't know as much because of the nature of this kind of problem, and we need to learn a lot more, both in the context of the EU and the U.S.
Thank you. Just for the sake of time, because we have about 15 minutes left, I want to make sure that you, the audience, have an opportunity to ask us any questions that you may have. This is a start of a dialogue, and there's a lot to unpackage here and to dig into, because these are very complex and challenging issues. So if anyone has a question for the panel, if you can please come up and use the microphone that's here in the aisle, that would be appreciated. I know it's always the first question's the toughest to ask. Go ahead, thank you.
My name is Darian. Is the mic too high or?
I think you're good.
Okay. So I am in Professor Sobolski's class, and a couple weeks ago I brought up the topic, about how there is the social media is being used to kind of gain traction between these terror groups. And I saw this, I don't remember, it was a YouTube or TikTok video about this girl who opened a completely new TikTok account, right? And she started liking conspiracy theory videos, and it kind of led her down this hole where it turned to alt-right content before it led to darker, more kind of separatist ideas, right? And in this type of situations, do you think there's any way that we can help, or can social media companies stop that kind of content from being pushed onto people who may just be looking into conspiracy theories?
I'll start in the context of the EU. My colleagues might have more to say with this, but that's the very point of the Digital Services Act, is to be for those companies to take that down as quickly as possible. But what you're suggesting is actually one of the problems potentially with the Digital Services Act, is that if I'm thinking of your account right, this was a person who probably got linked, started this new account and started to see stuff, maybe some high-profile influencers, right, are sort of where sort of people take this step first. This is where sort of high-profile influencers are the ones who are able to get around regulations. They're the ones who state pretty seemingly on the face of it somewhat innocuous things that hold little clues for those who are interested, or maybe that hook others into this, and people start thinking, what about this? And then the algorithms of those platforms take them deeper and deeper into these deep rabbit holes. But that DSA, the Digital Services Act, is intending to try to take that stuff down, right? They always run into problems doing this, because there was going to be a step behind, but they're trying to do this. In the US, we have a different problem. We can't regulate it. Hate speech is protected speech in the United States. Conspiracy thinking is protected speech in the United States. The U.S. has relied completely upon voluntarily getting social media companies to do something on their own, with their own definitions of what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, because of these constitutional protections. And we haven't dealt with that very well in the U.S. There was a summit on domestic extremism at the White House last week, where this sort of stuff came up in the context of violent extremism. There's talk of maybe repealing some of the liability protections that social media companies have, Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Act, that gives them blanket immunity for what content is posted. But that's politically divisive, so we'll see where it goes. Right now, there just aren't tools to do it in the U.S. is the short answer.
An uninformed question, but it's not hate speech. But if I'm right, because we talked about this the other day, we can't go into a movie theater and yell fire, right? So if we can't go into a movie theater and yell fire, how can we somehow use that as opposed to hate speech as a way to look at some of the issues here?
So I'm not a constitutional lawyer. Caveat.
Not yet.
But the difference is inciting action and not inciting action is my understanding. Inciting violence, right? You can't yell fire because this would cause public disturbance because people would act upon this. If you actually incite violence, if you actually call for violence, there are laws and regulations against this. But if you are just suggesting ideas that might lead others to violence, that's a little bit different, right?
And may I ask a question? I think that, thank you so much, both of you, for Darian for the question, and later on my colleagues for this. And I want to ask a question about this, which is following. Most of the time we think about the liberal state as being limited to act on this. And I think it's a very good approach. The question is whether or not it's the only approach we can give. I want to propose another approach, which is what the liberal state is not unable to do, but actually is doing in such a way that perhaps the liberal state needs this to happen, instead of being unable to stop it. Make sense? So I'm going to ask here, the question is, what is the liberal state gain? If there is, I don't know, maybe or maybe not, but there is any gain of the liberal state for hate speech to actually be pronounced when it doesn't lead to violence and blood? I just think that there is something to gain. I don't believe the liberal state is all objective and completely neutral. I just think the liberal state has a role there. So I'm going to ask, what is the history, for example, the question of the how is or why? What is the history of the idea of freedom of expression of the liberal state that might have a certain kind of gain by allowing these expressions to happen? So instead of thinking about the limits of the liberal state, it's about the power of the liberal state to impose certain things that they gain, but without acknowledging the gain. And we can explore if one possibility. I have some ideas, okay? But this is why I don't want to take the liberal state out of the equation as inactive or small. I just think the liberal state has a lot of power, and perhaps is letting this slide for a reason. Without getting into conspiracy theories, I don't think that there are 5 guys in a bunker saying how we can get this done. No, it's not about that. It is about a logic of the liberal state that helps the liberal state perpetuating itself by allowing this to happen. And just one idea about this is, what if the liberal state can gain by showing that these are the extremes we need to protect you from, and we are the only objective center ones who can protect one side and the other?
I'm going to interject. To your question, what the liberal state, and the question I think is it necessarily state actors that are doing this, or are these just political actors? It's not an action necessarily of state sanctioned all the time, maybe sometimes, not all the time, but are these tools that political actors use for particular gains? So I just want to say that, and just one other commentary, we're trying to make this comparison between Europe and the United States, and you have to be aware that in Europe, and it began in Germany, and now it is legislation throughout Europe, things like distortion of the Holocaust denial is not allowed speech. It is not allowed. It is considered illegal speech. And that's not true here in the United States. So just to understand, and I'm not a constitutional lawyer either, but just to understand the differentiation between Europe and the United States in that context of, since we were talking about freedom of speech, There are caveats in Europe, but that's one thing you can't touch.
I think that this is.
Oh, no, I'm thinking about reframing what you said in a way, because I don't think the state is this kind of rarefied thing, but I think the question for me is like, who benefits? Like, which interests benefit from having us be able to participate in this? I mean, that this is not, it's not as if everyone in the whole universe agrees and thinks that we, need to take action, obviously. But there are real interests, and they're not just, as you said, Santiago, I think is actually right. It's not just the interests of the crazy fringe people. There are interests being served, and I think it's up to us to really understand whose interests are being served, because that will help us, in fact, going forward.
Two quick comments. First of all, when I was referring, I think you're completely right, as the state interest, for me the state represents the interest of society, and in the US a lot has to do with lobby and economical power, and as such the state is representing economic power as well. So I was thinking about the state as separate, a state as involved in the process in particular ways, no? But I think it's very, very important. I think that, when you mention the limit about the Holocaust, I think that's an extremely important comparison to be made for the positives and limits. Because on the one hand, we can have limitations here in the US for a particular history, but at the same time, you can have it in Europe for a particular history. But now my question is, who gets to decide what a distortion of the Holocaust is or not? Who gets to decide that? Okay, because I just believe that the idea of Holocaust distortion fulfills a role of the state and society of post-Holocaust Europe that required that limit in order to present themselves as being something else of what they were before. And as such, they are going to employ it, instrumentalize it, and not instrumentalize it as a bad problem. Everyone instrumentalizes politics, everyone does it. But this fight against anti-Semitism is going to be instrumentalized this way, and sometimes has nothing to do with Jews. Has nothing to do with Jews. Many times has to do with much more with German identity, with French identity, has nothing to do with Jews, and Jews are just a pawn in the process, okay? Some Jews will agree with this, and some Jews will not agree with this, but it's not had to do with Jews. So I will just ask the question, what interests serve that limit as well?
Paul,
I think there's an interesting range here, right? Because I would agree that the basic idea is all systems empower certain actors and they get certain things. No matter how benevolent those systems are created, there are winners and losers in those systems, right? And so I don't dispute that. My question, I guess, is well, no, let me say, I don't think we shouldn't examine that. I think we should. But I think the pressing political problems in the U.S. and in the European Union are more about the types of actors that are trying to actively exploit those along the lines with what Professor Dudek was saying. So there's those deep questions that you have to ask, but in terms of policy ones, you have to look at Russia and what it's doing as a state actor to try to create division in the United States within the women's movement, the Women's March, right, and very purposefully doing this. And what the right-wing groups are doing to instrumentalize
instrumentalized.
There you go. Old anti-Semitic tropes, right? To be able to do that, and I would actually suggest that in the context of sort of the current crisis, for me that has to be the priority. We have to work on the deep stuff. But there, as you started out with, and this is where we agree, people are dying, right? And people's lives are being affected. So I not to say one approach is necessarily better than the other, but I think the manifestations of what we're seeing today are really nasty and terrible and need to be addressed.
Yeah. So. Professor Charnow?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, right, just because you came back to the Women's March, I think we also have to ask whose interests are being served by making abortion and women's health care illegal and body autonomy illegal in the United States, because it comes along in the same vein that these are not, there are real interests being served, and I think sort of tying it back together again, that these aren't separate things,
We are not all, these are issues and experiences, because also people will die. These are real people.
So I think we are out of time. And I will say, to just sort of bring it back to the European Union, if you think about the pieces of legislation and the treaties that I read to you, all of these ideas about discrimination, they're all linked together. And so our hope is that we continue this discussion looking at what's going on in the European Union, what's happening here in the United States. And I thank you all for attending. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.
So,